Hey everyone, welcome. So today we're going to dig into an idea that's pretty radical when you think about it. It asks a really fundamental question. Have we been reading literature all wrong? I mean, we're talking about a whole new way of looking at things, a lens that didn't just add a few new books to the shelf, but basically forced us to reread every single story we thought we already knew. I mean, have you ever really stopped to think about it? Why are certain books called classics? And who always gets to be the hero, right? Who's the main character and who gets pushed to the sidelines? For centuries, believe it or not, people just didn't really ask those questions. But then this revolutionary new approach came along and started to wonder, hey, wait a minute, what if we've only been getting half the story? Well, that new approach, it's called feminist literary criticism. And really, at its core, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses. Suddenly, you see the entire literary world completely differently. Everything from the characters on the page to the authors who wrote them, it all gets re-examined by asking one simple question. How has gender shaped all of this? And to really get a grip on its impact, we've got to go back and look at where it all started. So first up, a history of resistance. And it's super important to get this right off the bat. This is not some 20th century invention. Nope. The fight for a female voice in literature is a story of resistance that's been written over thousands of years. You know, for most of human history, if you were a woman and you wanted to write, that was a straight-up act of defiance. I mean, women were systematically denied education, they couldn't be financially independent, they were up against this massive ideology that basically demanded they stay silent and obedient. But here's the amazing part. They were never really silent. This timeline just shows what a persistent creative force we're talking about. I mean, you go all the way back to ancient Greece with Sappho's poetry. Then you've got Christine de Pizan in the Middle Ages, courageously debating male critics. Fast forward to the 17th century, you have prose like Afroban and Anne Bradstreet. And of course, that leads us to the 18th century with Mary Wollstonecraft arguing for women's education, then this incredible explosion in the 19th century with giants like Jane Austen, the Brontes, George Eliot, all the way to modernists like Virginia Woolf. The point is, women have always found a way to write, to create, and to resist. Okay, so all of that individual resistance was incredibly powerful, for sure. But the 20th century, that's when things really changed. It marked a huge turning point with the emergence of a formal, systematic movement. You see, the fight for political rights, think about the suffrage movement, for example, it created this incredible new energy, and that energy flowed right into the world of academia. Suddenly, the exact same questions being asked out on the streets about power and voice and equality, they were now being asked inside the classroom. It was this huge shift from just individual authors breaking barriers to scholars actually building a framework to try and dismantle the entire system. And wow, were their goals ambitious. I mean, we're not just talking about adding a few female authors to the syllabus here and there. No way. This was about fundamentally rewriting literary history from the ground up. It was about tracing a completely distinct female literary tradition. It was about analyzing how women were even represented in books written by men. It was basically a call to reevaluate, well, everything. And there were two books in particular that really became the intellectual cornerstones of this whole new movement. You've got Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own from 1929 and Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex from 1949. These two works just laid out the foundational arguments and provided the intellectual firepower that would go on to fuel generations of feminist thought. So naturally, when you start reevaluating the entire literary canon, it leads you to ask even deeper questions. The movement began to challenge not just what we read, but the very rules of language and thought we used to understand it in the first place. And this brings us to a really deep, kind of mind-bending question at the heart of the critique. For centuries, Western thought was built on this idea that there's a neutral, totally objective way to see the world. But feminist critics came along and started asking, hold on. Is that even possible? Or is our language itself, the very tool we think with, totally loaded with hidden values and assumptions we don't even notice? And that right there reveals the core challenge. Think about it. If the language we all use, our tool for thinking, has been shaped for centuries primarily by male experiences and values, how can a woman use that same language to express her own authentic reality? It's kind of like being asked to paint a brand new landscape, but you're only given a palette with half the colors. How could you possibly capture the full picture? This whole critique of language led them to look at the deepest, most fundamental structures of Western thought, and they traced the problem all the way back to thinkers like Aristotle. Okay, a key concept you have to understand here is something called binary oppositions. It's basically a way of thinking that splits the entire world into these rigid either-or pairs. You're either A or you're B. That's it. There is no in between. And what these critics argued is that this way of thinking is actually incredibly forceful and really, really limiting. And you can see how critics saw this playing out all over culture. Man versus woman, master versus slave, black versus white. They argued that in every single one of these pairs, one side is almost always seen as better or more valuable than the other. So this isn't just about words, right? This is a power structure that's baked right into our way of thinking. And so feminist critics just fundamentally rejected these kinds of divisive boxes, arguing instead for nuance, for complexity, and for a vision of unity instead of opposition. So, by rejecting these false divides, it led to what you could call a new honesty. The movement totally shattered the myth of pure, unbiased objectivity. Instead, it championed the idea that every single writer, every critic, brings their own subjective position to the page, a point of view that's been shaped by their unique life, their unique circumstances. And this focus on subjectivity, on our personal circumstances, it leads to what might be the movement's most profound insight of all: the undeniable, powerful connection between our physical bodies and our inner thoughts. Now, this is a seriously radical idea. It completely rejects the notion that thinking is just this abstract, universal thing that happens in a vacuum, like our minds are just floating around. Instead, it argues that our thinking is shaped at the very deepest level by the body we actually live in, where that body is, when it is, and what it is. This quote just captures the idea so powerfully. Whether my body is male or female will initially determine my thought and experience at a far deeper level than which books I read. Just let that sink in. Our lived physical experience, our gender, our race, our situation, shapes how we see the world more deeply than even our education. It's a complete reordering of where we think knowledge actually comes from. And you know what? We've probably all experienced a version of this. Remember being in high school and the teacher tells you, don't use the word I in your essay? What is that rule really asking you to do? It's asking you to erase yourself, your perspective, your history, your body, and pretend to be this disembodied, perfectly objective voice that doesn't actually exist. So when you boil it all down, the lasting legacy of this whole movement is this incredible shift in focus. It validated subjectivity, it championed personal experience, and it placed that undeniable link between our bodies and our stories right at the very heart of how we talk about literature. Which leaves us with one last, really powerful question to think about. This way of reading teaches us that we aren't just reading a story. In a way, our own story is reading the book right along with us. So the real question becomes, how does your body, your history, your unique experience change the story you see on the